I find that this particular topic can often split people who watch my channel. I'm talking about hypergamy because there is a bit of a culture online that really sees hypergamy as a negative instinct, almost proof of women's entitlement and their obnoxiousness in dating and their unrealistic standards and their judging of men. And then there's people who take a more moderate, I suppose, like biological view that's like, no, this is basically just survival of the fittest. It's sexual selection. Of course, women are going to try and find the top mate that they possibly can. And I fall mostly into the second camp, but I do think that a discussion of hypergamy purely relating it to biology is actually a dishonest framing of the issue because hypergamy as an instinct has found like incredible new expression in the social culture that we now live in. And I think that it's not an exaggeration to say that we're living in an age of runaway hypergamy. And so the real question that we're going to be talking about in this video is hypergamy getting worse? And obviously the instinct itself is kind of fixed. It's like a biological trait. But in terms of like the culture that enables hypergamy, absolutely that's getting stronger. And worse is a somewhat subjective term. It's like, well, is it worse for who? My perspective is, yes, it's going to get worse for the majority of women and the majority of men, but there is actually one small segment of the population that's going to get better for, which we'll get into that. But first, let me just ask Matt to get his perspective on what I've just said. Do you think that hypergamy is a positive instinct?
I think it's an instinct that is as positive as any other instinct, the instinct for survival, the instinct for, sweating when it gets too hot. I actually consider it's quite neutral. It's functional rather. And I would never begrudge someone for having an instinct. I have instincts that are kind of the male equivalent of hypergamy. I desire a certain quality of mate, short-term, long-term, whatever you're talking about. I have filters that one needs to pass through. And women do often decry those filters as unfair and cruel in the same way that men do about hypergamy. And so I think they're neutral. Instincts are instincts.
I think I don't see men as being hypergamous or there being necessarily an equivalence there, but I have heard women and even some men make that argument. Men are just hypergamous as looking for the best mate possible. But I think that that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what hypergamy is in a specific course. But let me check to see, are you in that camp? Do you think men are equally hypergamous?
I wouldn't call it hypergamous because hypergamy, more or less by definition, is the desire to rise up certain social hierarchies. Men are much more indiscriminate with their sexuality. But if a man is looking for a long-term mate, especially for the mother of his children, and he's wanting to be picky, then he's going to have I would strongly counsel him to, and a lot of men do have strong filters, which would be kind of functionally hypergamous. It's not for the same degree of like how much money or how high are you in whatever social hierarchy, but it's going to be possibly his own constructed hierarchy that would have some patterns that we could recognize.
Yeah, 100%. So both men and women should have standards for who they date. The reason why I don't think you can actually call it like a male version of hypergamy is because that ignores just how specific female evolution has crafted their sexuality, in that we're really talking about a mating up strategy to try and find that best possible deal, whereas men, as Matt said, are much more indiscriminate. You will find men who are quite happy to date far below their station, and the reason why they can get away with it is because they can actually invest a lot less in their relationships and still be in line with their sexual strategy. It can be indiscriminate sexuality, like spread your kind of seed, or it can just be the case, and I have made a video on this before, of a sort of male arrogance, I suppose, that says, I'm the man, I'm choosing my own destiny, I'm going this direction. Who I choose as my sidekick is not necessarily that big a deal. I don't have that much at stake. Whereas for a woman, at least when we're talking traditional feminine and masculine roles, she can't just choose a man indiscriminately because her life is going to be fundamentally altered by the course that he chooses. This goes back to my boats and islands analogy. It really, really matters for a woman in terms of how her life is actually going to look in the future, which island, which man she ends up being with. But for a man who's just making his own kind of island, he wants a boat to come up, but she's largely kind of sort of slot in with his life. And so hypergamy, I don't think is a shared instinct. And I think that the oversimplification of it is like, oh, this is just about standards, doesn't fully acknowledge the biological differences between men and women. But let's first, before we get into the social stuff, let's just talk about biologically why hypergamy actually exists. Okay, so if you're going to think about this from a tribal context, obviously the women want their children to be the strongest, the healthiest, the happiest, the most likely to survive. And so when she's looking around at the potential mates, maybe there's 15, 20 young guys that she can choose from, her instincts are pushing her towards choosing the man that's going to create the best children and also going to be able to provide for them. That's actually important because understand, what would humans look like right now in the year 2022 if hypergamy had never been an instinct, if we didn't have this female sexual strategy actually guiding us towards the best and the best? Well, it means that indiscriminately, all of the loser men, like the low value men, would have been breeding at just the exact same rate. And as a whole, the quality of human beings in terms of genetics would have gone down, 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 down. So what you're looking at is a sort of sexual survival of the fittest, where by women's choosing this, they're making sure that only the best genes propagate. And some people don't realize this because it can be a difficult thing to sort of grasp your head around, but you've probably heard that statistic, Matt, that says you have twice as many female ancestors as you have male ancestors. And at first glance, you're like, that couldn't possibly make sense. You've always had like a man and a woman, conceptual child. It should be 50-50. But what they're really talking about there is that, let's say if the average woman produced 2 children, the average man who did reproduce, he made 4 children to counteract the fact that one guy got completely left behind. And so you have a much smaller strata of men actually accounting for the large majority of the population that exists. So when you hear that, you realize that only 2 in 5 men actually reproduce. You realize that hypergamy is one of the most brutal evolution instincts that actually exists in terms of culling the herd, in terms of quality. And in that sense, women are really the ones who are tasked with ensuring the genetic quality of the future into the humans. Now, as a species, like the way we've just been talking about it, you can see, right, hypergamy is a good thing, I suppose. But there is a section of the population, especially in today's culture, where hypergamy is really fucking with them, because we now live in an age of like equality. We don't like the idea that some humans are better than others. We want to give that credence to the idea that everybody's kind of equal. And so that idea that 40% of men are just never, 60% of men are never going to reproduce because they're not high quality enough, that really grates with our modern cultural ideas about, equality. And so you've got these men now who are falling outside of that instinct of hypergamy. They're not high quality enough. They haven't achieved enough. They're not good looking enough to be able to meet women's standards. And they're pissed about it. And this is where you see like incel culture and things like that coming up. So that was quite a long sort of monologue and sort of explanation. But I do want to now talk about the social changes that have caused hypergamy to sort of go haywire. But do you have anything that you want to add about the biological component before I move on, Matt?
Yeah, well, everything you described is quite spot on, I guess, on a slightly more constrained frame as well. Just to touch on something you'd said earlier, the man that a woman chooses is likely going to have a bigger impact on her life than the woman that a man chooses will on his life, right? Because if a woman chooses the wrong man, there will come a time, likely many times, especially historically speaking, long-term historically speaking, that she'd be more or less incapacitated. She's not going to be, able to bear a lot of load on her own because she's pregnant, right? And she's nursing, and small children are quite a handful, as you know. And so choosing a man who can, compensate for that is a lot bigger of a deal. Whereas a man knocking up the wrong woman, I mean, as fucked up as it is, he can just leave. Like, he actually has that option. And it's just all he has with him is his shame, which is for some men a lot lighter than several children. So just that asymmetry there is just baked into our asimilarity reproductively. So that's important. But I will add one piece about the anger about hypergamy. And I think a lot of this is misplaced. I don't think the men are mad that hypergamy exists per se. I think that because a lot of men who don't care so much about hypergamy, it's because they're in relationships and they're doing fine. It's a lot of people don't care nearly as much about economic inequality when they have money. It kind of correlates with how you are there. So if you are in a position where hypergamy is working strongly against you, there's probably a deeper frustration with, God himself or whatever you want to call it, just frustration that you got the short end of the stick. And now you are, for reasons totally out of your control, seemingly, maybe not, are not being chosen by these women. And that society seems to be geared to increase that that discrepancy. And so I think the rage is deeper than just hypergamy. It's that it's hypergamy plus culture plus wherever you happen to be in the hierarchy. And that's what makes the rage.
So do you agree that hypergamy is getting worse?
Yeah. I think it is.
So that's where I somewhat agree with you, but I think that hypergamy probably is a legitimate source of this anger, or at least the current cultural expression of hypergamy, in that I think you've got men, and I've heard this from like Hey Hero consultations, who are like, I've been working for 10 years all through my 20s. I got an awesome degree. I'm now making these, the 6 figures. I've got great friends. I've got great hobbies. Like, I've really worked on myself. And yet I'm struggling to attract the attention of, 22-year-old ditzy kind of women who haven't achieved anything, haven't put in any near the work. And it's like, what reality are we living in where me, having done everything that I have done to become a high quality person, is struggling to get your attention, and you have nothing going for you other than the fact that you're young and pretty? Like, this is crazy. But what you're seeing there is the rising in female standards, I suppose, like enabled. And there's a really, really strong economic driver of this, in that it used to be that women were far more dependent upon men for their survival. Not even that long ago, like your parents, your grandparents' generation, definitely. But in this day and age, with women, having their own money, having access to government welfare, of course, with cultural movements of feminism and female empowerment and all of that stuff, you probably have never really found a time in human history where men have been devalued more than they are right now. And so you've got a lot of women's like, well, I used to need men, 50 years ago for this, and this. Now I only really need him for this. And even that, do I really kind of need him? So they're not really willing to make that commitment unless it really is a guy who completely excites them. You don't find women settling so much anymore. And so you've got a bunch of guys out there who are struggling to meet these standards going, this is insane. Women's standards are just completely outrageous. Why is it that these women who are quite low quality can still act so entitled, as though they deserve like a Brad Pitt or a Leonardo DiCaprio, and they're not going to settle for anything less? And you can see the evidence of this by the fact that the rates of singledom between 18 and 35 is so high. Never in human history have you ever found so many people just not partnering up. Now, I think most of that, like 90% of that, is driven from women who are just like, no, I'm not interested. I'm not going to get there. I'm only going to be looking for those top quality men. And I think that the situation is going to get worse. And I have a couple of predictions about what's going to happen if it does get worse, which you can probably guess, Matt. Do you want to make a prediction?
Yeah, I think I share some of those predictions, actually.
Yeah. So what I've said before is that we're going to find a lot more likelihood of men sharing women, and in the form of polygamy. It might take a little while. I don't know how quickly this will go, but I think at some point you're going to find women's standards and expectations have gotten so high that they're really only going to feel like it's worth it if they're able to get a man who is stupidly wealthy, stupidly influential, stupidly strong and good looking. And those kind of men are going to be able to sort of corner the market and then take multiple partners, because they're going to be more willing to share him than to have to settle for some average chump. Now, I don't think that's going to describe the high quality women. I think a genuinely beautiful, kind, feminine, intelligent, high quality woman is going to be able to, extract a monogamous commitment from a high quality man. But there will be a bunch of men who are like, you know what? I would actually rather have 3 average wives than 1 amazing one. Like, I'm all about that variety. And so I do foresee that coming. And that is going to be really bad, because the population of men who are then getting priced out of the dating market because women are just going to those, top options instead, they're going to become really, really angry and really, really like frustrated, which is why I think you've seen historically, like if you look at the hunter-gatherer tribes that exist at the moment, you don't tend to find that many societies where the tribal chieftain has 20 wives and then just expects all the men to participate. It's always been understood that in order to get a man to actually commit to his community and his tribe, he needs to have some skin in the game. He needs to have investment. And the best way for him to have that investment is through children, partnering up with a woman, giving birth. And then he's like, right, I'm helping contribute to my tribe because I want to see things good for the future generation. I want to see my genes propagated. For a bunch of men who are not going to reproduce, they're not going to have children, yet they're still expected to pay a whole bunch of taxes, and they have to live with being demonized because they're men. And if they're not able to get a girlfriend, they're blamed, like as though female standards aren't the problem. Their lack of quality is. They're going to get fucking frustrated and angry at that situation. And of course, we've already started to see the bubblings up of those extreme, like communities and then acts of violence in the real world that are motivated by that. And I can only imagine it's going to get worse. And that's why I'm talking about, it's why I do this channel. It's one of the reasons is I want to try and help men raise their quality so that this doesn't happen.
I believe that in all of human history, there has been a segment of the population of men who is, generally speaking, not sufficiently high on this of standards for the women in their tribe, whatever she's looking for, and that they are incels, basically for life. That percentage of men just has always existed. The poor will always be with us, essentially, and there have always been women who basically no man is good enough for. But I think with our modern culture and with the enabling, like you were describing, with all of the monetary supplementation of make it so that we don't need each other, quote, we don't need each other anymore. That's just going to make those two pools expand, right? And so the incel group will get bigger, and then the women who no man is good enough for will get bigger. But then they technically still have options. They can just link up with another guy who a woman is already sharing. And I think women are usually a lot more amenable to that than men are, unless the men are really desperate. I know that historically speaking, and it's kind of a self-perpetuating loop, a lot of the reason for polygamy was because men would die doing dangerous stuff. And so there was just more women than men around. And so men would take on like the wife of his brother because he's dead now. And so it was a little bit out of practicality, not so much that he just happened to have that much swagger. It was just a little bit more like, oh, well, I guess I'll take you because what else are you going to do? Bit of a family arrangement in that sense. But there's a little part of me that's like, I feel like we're kind of barking at the moon, if that's a weird phrase. We're yelling at the moon in the sense of saying, oh, it's women's standards are too high. Like, are you saying we should try to lower women's standards? Like, I feel like, I don't know if that would work on me. If a woman told me your standards are too high for women, I'm either going to be lonely or I'm going to succeed. But I don't think my standards are going to, maybe they'd go down if they were horribly unrealistic, but that might have to be self-generated. It's hard to imagine anything we could say or do to incentivize women to lower their standards. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I disagree. And here's the perspective. I do understand your point of view, but here's why I think that it's necessary. And as possibly like bitter and kind of misogynistic as you might see like those compilation videos of like men like telling women like, you're delusional, you're like that. You're like, oh, there's a negative energy behind this. But if it can be communicated in a nice way, I do think collectively the culture needs to tell women, yo, you're not that special. You need to chill the fuck out about your own desirability and come back to earth and be a little bit more realistic. And here's why I think that it's actually a worthwhile endeavor is because in truth, I think that their standards are completely ridiculous. I've just been doing some research on some Tinder studies, and they found that only an average man is matched, like a man who's judged to be of average attractiveness, by 1 in 115 women. That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. So women do need a sort of metaphorical shaking of the shoulders, like wake up, like this is not sustainable. What's going to happen is that if you maintain these high standards, you're not going to get anybody. And here's the problem as I see it at the moment is that women have been cushioned from the consequences so far, at least in terms of what the media covers, of what's going to happen in their 30s and 40s if they have not partnered up. And it's not good. Nobody wants to talk about it at the moment, but we are pretending as though women can have incredibly empowering lives, be child-free, they don't need no man, all of that stuff. There's not a really honest movement of older women going, yeah, my younger sisters, do not do what I did. I didn't settle. I kept being picky and choosy, and now I'm miserable, and I see my friends who have children, and I'm jealous, and I'm upset. And I'm pissed off that I wasted 10 years studying, and working and things like that instead of putting emphasis into making myself more desirable to men because I didn't think that it was important. I thought that men would find me as desirable at 35 as they did at 25, but I got a really rude awakening. That's a really real phenomenon, and I know it is because I've spoken to numerous women in my personal life who have expressed that exact sentiment, but you don't see that popularized in the mainstream. And so what I'm hoping is that with enough pressure, in this push that we have for social media transparency, everyone's sharing their innermost thoughts and things like that, that there will at some point come like a sort of avalanche of truth from older women saying, this was not good. I have regrets. Women, we need to wake up. And the younger women hear that, and it actually does instill a little bit of fear in them and goes, okay, I need to work harder in terms of my quality if I want to attract that high quality guy, and I need to be less picky. Oh, he's amazing in every way, but I don't like the way he uses toothpicks, so I moved on. No, work with it. Stick in the relationship a little bit longer. I know you've got 800 messages on Tinder waiting for you, but don't think that that's going to last forever and that all men are inherently replaceable. The more you swipe, the more picky you're going to become, because it's just feeding into your neurological makeup that you have that many options. Please resist. Realize that that's just a social media algorithm fucking with your brain. It's not reality. So what have I convinced you? Do you now think, when you've heard my perspective, that it's a good idea that we try and get women to lower their standards?
Yeah. So the question is not whether it's a good idea. The question is it even possible? And if it's not possible, then it feels like a bad idea. But you seem to believe that it is in fact possible, especially if older women are imparting their wisdom. You like that one. If older women are imparting their wisdom, that's effective. I mean, if older men, the reason why I stopped some of my very unsavory romantic practices when I was younger, I won't get into that, but it was basically I was making bad choices, and an older man talked me out of it. Several older men, actually, because I was I know a lot of those guys, and they helped me out. They really gave me good perspective on decades of life. They've seen their friends do this. They've seen their friends come out of this, and they say, here's what I see, here's what's going to happen to you. Lo and behold, it's exactly what happened to me, and I got out early enough, thank God. But I could have just persisted, and I have friends that are still persisting, and they're not very happy with themselves. So honoring one's wisdom, honoring the wisdom of one's elders is definitely the way that this is going to work for women. I don't think that we as young men, I mean, it's also hard for me to feel probably sufficiently motivated because I am not a victim of hypergamy. I've been chosen. And so I've chosen back. Right. And so it's a little bit abstract for me, this hypergamy issue. And many of my friends are in relationships. And so and the men who are experiencing the pain are the ones that we should be listening to. But then those are by definition the men that the women are least likely to listen to because they're the invisible men. And so I think that older women who made the mistake are in the position to make the biggest influence.
Yes.
And I'll help if I can, but I don't think my voice is going to be very welcome among young women these days to tell them to change their standards.
No, I completely agree. And we'll end on that note, which is that in terms of me trying to achieve my goal of getting women to have more realistic standards, I'm not talking to young women. I'm talking to older women and saying, you guys need to speak up. And so on that note, I'll kick it over to the audience. Have you ever told a woman that her standards are too high for the women? Have you had that perspective ever shared with you?
How did that go?
How did that go? Yeah. So let's keep the conversation going in the comment section. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you in the next one.